So let's talk to Joseph Kotrie-Monson now, who's a criminal lawyer who's worked on cases involving these noxious and corrosive substances of various kinds. He's also director of Mary Monson Solicitors. Joseph, a good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Petrie.
Now, I know you've been listening to the last sort of 55 minutes on LBC. What do we need to do to stop this?
Well, before we go any further, I just want to say that whenever you mention names like Katie Piper or Adele Bellis, these heroes, I'm in awe of these people. They have suffered huge, often disfiguring attacks, and the idea that they can try to turn through force of their own personalities and will that into something positive and draw to attention something that really we're not talking enough about, the government's not talking enough about. I just think it's awe-inspiring.
Why is it, Joseph, that we're not, that government is it because the numbers are too low? I mean, what do we need to do? How many people need to suffer?
I think it's caught the government's napping, to be honest. I think part of the problem is that, as we've heard from the excellent Sheldon Thomas earlier, I mean, there's very little that I can disagree with that he says, but the reality is that this has been going on in gangs. It's nothing new, but these are people that nobody really pays much attention to until it spills onto their street. You know, if somebody gets killed by a stray bullet and they're not a gang member, that's news. But, I mean, we do have laws. Let's get into the law. We do have laws that deal with this. The Offences Against the Person Act, which, of course, covers GBH, actually covers an offence. And most people, when they're convicted, are actually convicted of applying corrosive substances with intent to cause GBH. You know, I know it doesn't mention acid. And these people, they do get the severe sentences. Probably what's not signposted well enough is this is not a specific offence. It doesn't have specific minimums. Maybe there's an argument for that. This law 150 years ago, some of it has something in common with the situations we have now, some doesn't. You know, women and young people appear to feature disproportionately among the victims. The nature of this type of assault is that not only does it have the effect of damaging somebody's face, the actual intention of the attacker is to disfigure and deprive their victim of the ability to interact with other people. Now, that's abhorrent. And finally, acid, this weapon that's used, unlike guns, Petrie, or combat knives, is freely available. It's easier to buy acid than it is to buy a box of matches. You know, these substances that have very little use for most law-abiding people, you know, and which can seriously and permanently injure people, its sales should be regulated, as it is in many other countries where this is a problem. This is a disgusting crime, but it doesn't just need to be dealt with in terms of sentencing. I mean, you've heard of me talking about the idea of a new offence or new criteria. We've had that for knives. The reason we've had it for knives is because there was a public outcry, and part of educating people about the danger of knives is to legislate, you know, minimum terms, whatever. These are horrific assaults. It doesn't just injure somebody, it violates a person. People do need to know there are specific consequences to them using acid, but that's only part of it. And you've heard from Sheldon Thomas, more work needs to be done to make sure that people realise that this is socially unacceptable behaviour in the same way that sexual assaults are. You know, think of the stigma that we have associated with rape, for example. This is on a par with rape. I don't think anyone would argue this is on a par with rape for its seriousness. Shame, I would suggest, is usually a more effective tactic than fear is, Petrie. When you want to stop somebody doing something or change somebody's mindset. Of course, part of this does point to a problem with gang culture. You know, standards, families, we've heard these words. It's very easy to say to, you know, Sheldon Thomas, who we heard earlier, well, you're just being wishy-washy. You know, the reality is you cannot separate a problem like this when it affects gangs in some ways from things like knives. But
that's why, I mean, the idea that we can't call this acid, carrying it on the street, a weapon, to me, it cannot be the case, because we've all got knives in our kitchens and we've managed to weaponise knives in the eyes of the law. We must be able to find a way of calling acid carried on the street for no good reason a weapon.
I don't think we disagree about that, Petrie, but I think it's wrong to confuse people like Sheldon Thomas for an apologist, when actually what he's saying is the problem is more complicated and we do need to re-educate. When children are carrying acid, there is something wrong with our society that is not just about the children. They weren't doing it 20 years ago. Why are they doing it now? By the time we start asking lawyers and judges to stop the problem is already so great that the horse has bolted. I'm saying there is a strong case for legislation. Of course there is, and I think we need to look at this more carefully than just saying, well, did it have this current sentencing guidelines, did it have an ongoing effect on the...
Briefly, Joseph, if I can, because we're up against the clock as ever. Would you also call for people who attend hospital with corrosive liquid burns to have to be reported in the same way that anybody who's there with a gunshot wound or a knife wound has to be reported?
I think there are those types of arguments. Of course, it does depend on the circumstances. I remember being a student at chemistry at school and someone in our class got acid on their hand. I don't know if they had to go to hospital, but I don't like to think that the police would be called out to hospital to deal with that because somebody was ticking a box. I think a common sense approach, but in principle, what you're saying is right. It's
been good to talk to you. Joseph Kotrie-Monson, thank you very much indeed for that.